A woman standing in a cold, sterile courtroom. Her hands are clasped tightly in her lap, not out of nervousness, but because she's trying to hold herself together. She's wearing a cream-colored blouse she ironed 3 times that morning. She doesn't know why she bothered. Maybe she thought looking composed on the outside would somehow convince the walls inside her chest to stop crumbling. Across from her sits her husband of 6 years. He's leaning back in his chair like he's at a poker table, not a divorce hearing. There's a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, lazy, careless, almost entertained. His lawyer whispers something in his ear, and he actually laughs. A short, sharp sound that cuts through the quiet room like a blade. The judge looks up. The lawyers shift. But the woman, her name is Siomina. She doesn't even flinch. Not on the outside. Because she's been practicing for this moment for months. She knew this day was coming. She thought she was ready. And yet, nothing could have prepared her for the casual cruelty of that laugh. The way he dismissed 6 years of her life in a single, breathless chuckle. She swore to herself that morning that she would not cry. She does not cry. But somewhere deep inside her, something breaks clean in half. Now, fast forward. Same woman. Same quiet, careful eyes. But everything else has changed. She's stepping out of a sleek black car in front of a penthouse skyscraper in the heart of Seoul. Behind her, 2 men in dark suits scan the street with practiced, cold efficiency. And beside her, close enough that his arm brushes hers, is a man the entire city fears. Park Jae-won, head of the Black Crane organization, the most dangerous man in South Korea. A ghost story told in whispers in the back rooms of parliament buildings and in the trembling voices of police commissioners who know better than to say his name too loudly. He is not smiling. He never smiles. But his eyes are locked on Mina with an intensity so fierce, so absolute, that every person within a 20-foot radius unconsciously steps back. And her ex-husband? The one who laughed in that courtroom? He's watching from across the street, pale, sweating, barely recognizable beneath the weight of his own terror. This is the story of how Siomina went from the most discarded woman in her social circle to the most protected woman in South Korea. And it is not a simple love story. It is a kind of love story that only exists on the razor's edge between power and ruin, between a man who built his empire on silence and a woman who finally refused to stay quiet. Let's start with the man. Park Jae-won was not born into power. That's important to understand, because men who inherit power wear it like a suit, comfortably, casually. Men who build power wear it like armor. And Park Jae-won was all armor, all the time. He was 34 years old, though most people who met him would have guessed older. Not because he looked worn, quite the opposite. He was striking in the way that very dangerous things are often striking. Tall, sharp-jawed, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He dressed immaculately, always black, always tailored, always understated. There were no flashy watches, no gold rings, no ostentatious displays of wealth. He didn't need them. His presence alone announced everything that needed to be announced. He ran the Black Crane organization from the shadows of Seoul's most gleaming towers. On paper, he was the CEO of JW Holdings, a private investment firm with a portfolio that spanned real estate, logistics, and private security. In reality, JW Holdings was the clean face on something far older, far darker, and far more deeply embedded in the city's bones than any government official would publicly admit. The Black Crane did not deal in petty crime. There were no street-level operations, no turf wars over corners and alleyways. Park Jae-won operated at altitude, brokering deals between powers that could not be seen in the same room together, moving money that governments pretended didn't exist, maintaining a careful, ruthless order in the underworld that, paradoxically, kept certain parts of the city safer than they would have been without him. He had rules, ironclad ones. And the first rule, the one that every member of the Black Crane learned before they learned anything else, was this: never harm civilians. Never. It wasn't mercy exactly. It was strategy, and it was pride, and it was something else too. Something in Jaiwan that he'd never quite had the language for. A line he'd drawn for himself when he was 19 and watching the world burn around him. A line he swore he would never cross. He had enemies, of course. Men who wanted his territory, his connections, his power. And he had handled each and every one of them with the same cold, methodical precision that defined everything he did. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty, but he was absolutely, utterly relentless. He did not have friends. He had lieutenants, allies, and subordinates. He did not have relationships. He had arrangements. Somewhere along the way, and he couldn't have told you exactly when, he had simply stopped expecting warmth from the world. The world was a system. Systems could be managed. Feelings could not. Or so he believed. Until the night he walked into a hospital corridor and found a woman sitting alone on a plastic chair, holding a paper cup of cold coffee with both hands, staring at nothing. And something in his chest moved in a way had not moved in years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, Mina. Seo Mina was 31. She had been, for the past 6 years, the wife of Choi Dong-woo, heir to Choi Construction, one of Seoul's mid-tier property empires. By every external measure, her life looked comfortable. A beautiful apartment in Gangnam. A wardrobe that other women admired. Invitations to the right charity galas, the right dinner parties, the right circles. But comfort and happiness are two very different countries, and Mina had been living in one while desperately missing the other. She was a pediatric nurse by training, a detail that Dongwoo had never been particularly proud of. His world prized titles and social polish, and pediatric nurse didn't sit as neatly at a dinner table as interior designer or philanthropist board member. He'd asked her more than once to consider transitioning into something more suitable. She'd refused more than once, politely but firmly. That firmness, that quiet, unmoving core of her, was the thing he'd fallen in love with when they first met, and the thing he'd slowly come to resent. Their marriage had eroded not with explosions, but with silences, with missed dinners and unanswered texts, and the particular loneliness of lying next to someone who is already, in every way that matters, decided to leave. Mina had known for 2 years that things were over. She'd spent one of those years trying to save what couldn't be saved. She'd spent the other year saving herself instead. When she finally filed for divorce, Dongwoo had been genuinely surprised. Not because he didn't want out. He was already in love with someone else, a socialite named Yuna, who wore her ambition like perfume, everywhere and unmistakable. He was surprised because he'd assumed Mina would simply wait, that she would stay in the comfortable apartment and accept whatever version of their arrangement he decided to offer her. The idea that she might be the one to walk away had genuinely never occurred to him. And so when she did, he was not gracious about it. He fought the divorce on every front, not because he wanted her back, but because he wanted to win. He contested the settlement, froze their joint accounts, and let it be quietly known in their social circle that Mina had been unstable and difficult. He hired a lawyer famous for scorched earth tactics. And in that courtroom, when the judge granted the uncontested portion of the proceedings, he laughed. He actually laughed. Mina walked out of that courthouse with less than she'd walked in with 6 years earlier and every intention of rebuilding from zero. She had her nursing license. She had a small apartment near Mapo that she'd quietly rented 3 months before the divorce was finalized. She had her dignity, still intact, though it cost her. And she had absolutely no idea that her life was about to be rearranged by a force she couldn't have imagined. 4 or 5 years before Mina ever crossed paths with Park Jae-won, the Black Crane organization had been in a cold war with a rival faction known as the Red Veil. The Red Veil was newer, hungrier, and significantly less principled. Where Jae-won operated with structure and a strict code, the Red Veil operated with chaos. And they discovered, much to the discomfort of Seoul's criminal ecosystem, that chaos was effective. They'd been eating into Black Crane territory for 2 years, not through direct confrontation. They weren't stupid enough for that. But through subtlety, through corruption, through bribing officials that the Black Crane had trusted for years, through feeding information to law enforcement agencies in ways that created problems without ever leaving fingerprints. Jaiwan knew exactly who was doing it. He also knew that moving against the Red Veil directly, right now, would be exactly what they wanted, a visible escalation that would bring heat from law enforcement and destabilize the careful balance he'd spent a decade constructing. So he waited. He gathered information. He built his countermove with the patience of someone who understood that timing was everything, and that the right move at the wrong moment was the same as the wrong move. His closest lieutenant, a man named Han Seo-jun, lean and quick-eyed, who'd been with Jaiwan since they were both teenagers surviving the streets of Incheon together, managed the day-to-day operations. 2 other core members, a woman named Cha Yunji, who handled financial intelligence, and a former Special Forces operative named Ryu Taemin, who handled physical security, completed the inner circle. They were, by any reasonable measure, a formidable machine. Efficient, loyal, disciplined. But Jaiwan was tired in a way that efficiency couldn't fix. It was a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. He was tired of the calculations, tired of the isolation, tired of sitting at the top of a tower he'd built with his own hands and feeling absolutely nothing when he looked at the view. He would never have admitted this to anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing you admitted in his world. And then, on a Tuesday night in November, one of his men was injured during what should have been a routine information exchange that went wrong, a Red Veil setup that Jaiwan hadn't anticipated. The man's name was Kim Juno, 26 years old, one of Jaiwan's most promising newer recruits. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough that they needed immediate medical attention outside of the organization's usual channels, which were currently compromised. Seo-jun made a call. An old contact, a doctor who owed them a favor, was working a night shift at a mid-sized private hospital in Mapo-gu. They could bring Juno there quietly, off the books. Jaiwan went himself. He always went himself when one of his people was hurt. Another one of his rules. They arrived at the hospital at 11:47 p.m. and in the waiting corridor outside the emergency treatment rooms, sitting alone on a plastic chair, holding a paper cup of cold coffee with both hands, staring at absolutely nothing, was Seo Mina. She was there for a patient, a 7-year-old boy named Jiho, one of the children on her ward at the pediatric clinic where she'd been working since the divorce. Jiho had been rushed to emergency with a sudden fever that spiked to a terrifying level, and his mother, a single woman who spoke almost no Korean, having emigrated from Vietnam 2 years ago, was somewhere inside the building, lost in the bureaucratic maze of forms and insurance checks, barely holding herself together. Mina had come in on her day off. She'd gotten a call from a colleague and come without hesitating, because that was who Mina was. She showed up, even when she was exhausted, even when she was still quietly processing the wreckage of her own life. She showed up for the people who needed her. She didn't notice the group of men who entered the corridor. Or, rather, she noticed them the way you notice weather. A shift in the atmosphere. A sudden sense that the air pressure had changed. She looked up and looked directly at Park Jaiwan. Later, she would struggle to explain what she felt in that moment. It wasn't fear exactly, though it probably should have been. There was something about him, the stillness of him, the way he stood like the room had been arranged around him rather than him entering it. That was so profoundly, strangely real that for one disoriented second, everything else in her peripheral vision blurred. He looked at her. His men were moving around him, already in conversation with a nurse at the desk further down the corridor. But Jaiwan had stopped walking. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not cold, not warm, not curious. Something more fundamental than any of those. Like he was simply registering the fact of her, and the fact of her was somehow significant. She looked away first, back to her coffee cup, back to the meaningless middle distance she'd been staring at. He kept walking. That would have been the end of it. Two strangers in a hospital corridor in the middle of the night. A moment of eye contact. Nothing more, except that 20 minutes later, she heard it. The sound of a child crying. And not just crying. The sharp, terrified wailing of a small person who is in pain and doesn't understand why and only wants a familiar face. She recognized the voice immediately. Jiho. They must have moved him to a room nearby. She stood without thinking and turned toward the sound, and immediately collided with a wall. Not a wall, a chest. She stumbled backward. Two hands caught her arms, steadying her with a grip that was firm but careful. She looked up. Park Jiwon looked down. Up close, he was even more, she didn't have the word, more present. The dark eyes were studying her with that same unreadable intensity, but there was something in them now, something faint and almost imperceptible, like the first shift of light before sunrise. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low and quiet, not gentle, exactly, but measured in a way that felt, somehow, like care. "I'm fine." She pulled back slightly, and he released her immediately, hands dropping to his sides. She glanced down the corridor toward the sound of crying. "I need to. There's a child." "Go," he said simply. She went. She sat with Jiho for 40 minutes, holding his small hand and talking to him softly in the particular murmuring cadence that children responded to, until the fever medication started working and his tears gradually subsided into exhausted sleep. His mother sat on the other side of the bed, clutching Mina's other hand and whispering thank yous in 2 languages. When Mina finally walked back out into the corridor, it was empty. The group of men was gone. The man with the dark eyes was gone. She stood alone in the fluorescent quiet and felt, unexpectedly, the ghost of something she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't name it. She wasn't even sure she wanted to try. She went home. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat at her kitchen table until 3 a.m. thinking about nothing in particular. She did not think about him. She thought about him constantly. It was not a fairy tale meeting. It was not love at first sight in any version of the story that makes that phrase feel clean and simple. What it was instead was a recognition, that specific unsettling phenomenon where you encounter a stranger and some deep wordless part of you says, "Oh, there you are." They met again 4 days later. It wasn't engineered. Mina's clinic was 3 blocks from a coffee shop she used as her quiet hour between morning and afternoon shifts, a small place with good espresso and the particular charm of being slightly hard to find. She was at her usual corner table on a Friday afternoon, reviewing patient files on her tablet, when the door opened and Park Jiwon walked in. He saw her immediately. He paused, and she watched something cross his face, fleeting, quickly controlled, before he walked to the counter and ordered. He did not look at her again. She looked at him twice and told herself to stop. He collected his coffee. He turned. His eyes found hers with the same unerring precision as before. This time, she didn't look away. He walked toward her table. He stopped at a reasonable distance. "The boy," he said. "Is he all right?" She blinked. "You. How did you know he was my patient? You went to him when you heard him crying. You knew his voice." A slight pause. "I noticed things." She studied him for a moment. "He's better. Fever broke fully yesterday. He'll be home by the weekend." He nodded once, a small, contained gesture of what she realized, with some surprise, was genuine relief. "Sit down if you want," she heard herself say. "Or don't. I don't need the company." The corners of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something. "That's an unusual invitation. I'm an unusual person." He sat. They talked for 45 minutes. It was not a smooth conversation. There were pauses that stretched. There were moments where he answered her questions with a precise economy that bordered on evasion, and moments where she suspected he was calculating what to say in ways that most people never bother to. But there was also this, the particular quality of his attention. When Jiwon listened to her, He listened completely. No phone glanced at. No eyes wandering to the room. The full, undivided weight of his focus, which was, she discovered, both slightly overwhelming and unexpectedly wonderful. He did not tell her his name that day. He asked for hers. She gave it. "That's an unusual trade," she said, when she realized he hadn't offered his in return. "I have an unusual job." I gathered. She did not ask. He noted that, and something in him relaxed by a fraction, so small it would have been invisible to anyone else. But it was there. They met again, and again. Never planned. At first, the coffee shop became a shared territory, and then, gradually, an arrangement. Thursdays at 4. If he was in the city, if she wasn't working late. No promises. No expectations. He told her eventually that his name was Jywin. Not his full name. Not yet. But something. She told him about the divorce. Not in one sitting, and not with tears. She told it the way she'd learned to tell hard things, plainly, without apology, watching his face for the reaction that usually came. The pity, or the discomfort, or the well-meaning, but ultimately patronizing, "You deserve better." Instead, he was quiet for a long moment. And then, he laughed. Not a question. He'd caught that detail, the one she'd mentioned almost in passing, and he'd locked onto it with an intensity that was quietly volcanic. "Yes," she said. Another silence. His jaw was tight in a way that she would come to recognize, the physical tell of an emotion he was choosing not to act on. "I'm fine," she added. "I know you are," he said. And she believed him in a way she hadn't believed anyone who'd said something similar. He didn't say it because she needed reassurance. He said it because he meant it, because he could see it, the fineness in her, the quiet toughness that she carried without performing. It was somewhere around the 6th or 7th Thursday that she understood she was falling for him. The understanding arrived with a kind of calm certainty that she imagined must accompany a terminal diagnosis, clear, undeniable, and absolutely terrifying. She knew, in the general sense, that he was not a civilian. The men who sometimes waited in a car outside, the way conversations near him tended to stop when she arrived, the careful deliberateness of everything he said and didn't say. She wasn't naive. She was a woman who had married a man who smiled beautifully in public and was careless in private. She knew the difference between who someone appeared to be and who they were. But she had also come to know over those weeks that Park Jywin was precisely who he appeared to be, which was to say, complex, controlled, and in possession of a moral code that was not simple or conventional, but was entirely real. He had never lied to her. He had withheld, yes, of course. But what he gave her, he gave honestly. That mattered to her more than she had words for. She didn't ask about the specifics of his work. He didn't offer them. But one evening, walking back to her apartment after they'd spent an hour at the Han River talking about almost nothing, the kind of conversation that is really about everything, she stopped at her door and looked up at him. "You should know," she said quietly, "that I don't scare easily." He looked at her for a long moment. The city moved around them, indifferent and bright. "I know," he said, and the way he said it, with something raw and unguarded beneath the control, told her everything she needed to know about what she meant to him, even if he wasn't ready yet to say it out loud. She went inside. He stood on the pavement for a moment before turning back to the waiting car. His expression didn't change. But when C.O. June, seated in the driver's seat, glanced in the rear-view mirror, he kept whatever observation he might have had entirely to himself. He had known Jywin for 15 years. He had never once, in all that time, seen him stand still just to watch someone walk through a door. The Red Veil had been watching. This was, in retrospect, inevitable. Park Jywin was surveilled by his enemies as a matter of course. His movements, his meetings, his patterns, all of it was monitored and analyzed by people who were looking for weaknesses in his armor. And for years, they had found none. He was a closed system. He had no vulnerabilities they could exploit. And then C.O. Mina started meeting him for coffee on Thursdays. Her name landed on a Red Veil analyst's desk in December, 6 weeks after the hospital corridor. It took them another 2 weeks to confirm what she was. Not an operative, not a business associate, not anyone with any connection to the underworld. A pediatric nurse. A divorced woman with a small apartment in Mapo and a quiet, ordinary life. Which meant, in the cold arithmetic of criminal strategy, that she was perfect. The man who led the Red Veil was named Oh Jung-sik, 50 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular kind of ruthlessness that gets dressed up in expensive suits and calls itself pragmatism. He'd started his career as a legitimate businessman and shifted sideways into criminal enterprise with the easy adaptability of someone who'd never had strong feelings about the difference. He understood, better than most, that the way to defeat a disciplined man was not to attack his strength, but to attack the things that made him human. In early January, one of Mina's colleagues, a young man named Dr. Lee, who worked at the same clinic, was quietly approached by a Red Veil intermediary. Dr. Lee had gambling debts. The offer was simple: information about CO Mina's schedule, her patterns, her vulnerabilities. Dr. Lee, to his lasting shame, said yes. Mina didn't know any of this. What she knew was that on a cold Wednesday evening, walking home from her late shift, she felt suddenly, profoundly certain that she was being followed. She had learned this from years of working night shifts in unfamiliar parts of the city, a specific bodily knowledge, the way the skin at the back of your neck becomes acutely, wordlessly aware of being watched. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She kept her pace steady and pulled out her phone. She called Jaiwan. He answered on the first ring. "I think someone is following me," she said. Her voice was calm. There was a silence on his end, so brief it was barely measurable. Then, "Where are you exactly?" she told him. She heard him already moving. "Go into the convenience store on your right. Stand near the counter where the cashier can see you. Do not leave until I call you back." She did exactly that. 11 minutes later, his car pulled up outside. He came in himself, not Seo-jun, not Taemin. Him. He looked at her first, a quick, thorough visual check, and only exhaled when he confirmed that she was physically unharmed. Then the look on his face hardened into something she hadn't seen directed at her before, the controlled, cold fury of a man who had just discovered that the one thing he could not afford to lose had been made a target. He took her to a safe house that night. Not the penthouse, a different property, smaller, more discreet, staffed by two of his most trusted people. He sat across from her at a kitchen table and told her, for the first time, the actual shape of his world. Not everything, but enough. The Black Crane, the Red Veil, the war that had been conducted in silence for 2 years. The fact that someone was using her to get to him. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known this was a possibility?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Since the second Thursday. And you kept meeting me anyway." A beat. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me to stop?" Another beat, longer this time. "Because I couldn't." It was the most vulnerable thing she had ever heard him say. And she understood in that moment the full weight of what this was for him. A man who had spent his entire adult life in perfect control of every variable, telling her that she was the one variable he could not bring himself to eliminate. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand. He looked up at her. Something in his face shifted, slowly, like a tectonic plate that has been under pressure for years, finally beginning to move. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "But I need you to stop treating me like something fragile." "I don't think you're fragile," he said, and his voice was low and fierce. "I think you are the least fragile person I have ever met. That is not the problem." "Then what is?" He turned his hand under hers and held it. His grip was careful and iron-strong at once. "The problem is that I am not capable of being moderate about this. About you." He paused. "And in my world, that is the most dangerous thing I have ever said." She understood him completely. She didn't say it back in words. She just held on. It was the wrong moment for declarations. The Red Veil knew about her. Jaiwan's most carefully guarded secret, the fact of his own heart, had been found out. And now the long, cold chess game he'd been playing was about to shift into something infinitely more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Oh Jung-sik made his move in February. It was elegant, as betrayals always are when they've been planned carefully. He chose a night when he knew Jaiwan would be occupied, a meeting with a government liaison that had taken months to arrange and could not be canceled without significant consequence. He chose a time when Mina's protection detail had been reduced to a single driver, not because Jaiwan had become careless, but because the Red Veil had spent 3 weeks creating a series of small, credible distractions that pointed threats in the wrong direction. They took Mina at 8:15 p.m. outside the hospital. Fast, professional, 3 men in a gray van, and she was gone before anyone on the street fully registered what had happened. She left a mark, though. One of the men had a long scratch down his left forearm that required disinfecting. She was not, as she had said, fragile. Jaiwan was in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a hotel when Seo-jun appeared at the door with an expression that Jaiwan had never seen on his face before, the specific expression of a person delivering news that they know will change everything. He was on his feet before Seo-jun finished the first sentence. What followed was 3 of the most intense hours of Park Jaiwan's life, which was saying something for a man who had built an empire from nothing with his own hands in the most dangerous city on earth. The calculation he'd spent years perfecting, the cold, methodical precision that defined him, fractured at the edges. Not because he panicked. He did not panic, but because every protocol, every contingency, every strategy that his mind produced was immediately contaminated by one single variable. Her face. Her voice. The way she'd said, "I'm not leaving," like it was a promise she intended to keep. He had to think through her, not around her, for the first time in his life. And it was simultaneously the most disorienting and the most clarifying thing he'd ever experienced. Oh Jung-sik sent a message through an intermediary at 9 p.m. The terms were predictable. Territory, connections, a formal seeding of the Black Crane's Northern Soul Network. Walk away from everything he'd built, or the woman would be used to send him a message he couldn't ignore. Jaiwan did not respond. What he did instead was call Chai Yunji and tell her that she had 40 minutes to find every single financial pressure point Oh Jung-sik had ever tried to hide, and that if she couldn't do it in 40 minutes, she should do it in 30. He called Ryu Taemin and told him to find the gray van. He called in every favor that was owed to him, and there were many, carefully maintained over years, never called in because he didn't need to, all of them at once. And then he called the one government official who knew, with absolute certainty, that the continued discretion of Park Jaiwan was the only thing standing between himself and a very public, very career-ending scandal. And he explained, concisely and without emotion, what he needed. In the underworld, as in everything else, it is not violence that is most powerful. It is information. And Park Jaiwan had spent 15 years accumulating information with the quiet, relentless patience of a man who understood that knowledge was the only currency that never devalued. Oh Jung-sik learned this at 11:30 p.m. when 3 things happened in rapid succession. His primary financial holding company was frozen by a regulatory agency acting on an anonymous tip. 2 of his most senior lieutenants received visits from men whose connections to the current administration Oh Jung-sik had spent years trying to cultivate for himself. And Ryu Taemin, whose background in special forces was not merely decorative, located the warehouse in Seo-gu, where Mina was being held. Jaiwan went himself. Seo-jun argued briefly. Jaiwan ended the argument with a look. He went himself. Mina was unharmed. They'd been holding her as a bargaining chip, not a target. Oh Jung-sik was many things, but he understood, at least, that physical harm would have been a line that Jaiwan would have burned the entire city to answer. She was in a locked room with a cold radiator, still wearing her work clothes, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall in a posture that Jaiwan recognized immediately as deliberate composure, the physical performance of calm that costs enormous reserves of internal strength to maintain. When the door opened and she saw him, the composure cracked. Not into tears, into something more complex than tears. Relief and anger, and something fierce and overwhelming that she directed at him immediately. "You took long enough," she said. The two guards who'd come with Jaiwan exchanged a glance. 3 hours and 42 minutes, he said, his voice completely controlled. "I apologize for the delay." She stood. She crossed the room. She put both hands flat on his chest and looked up at him with an expression that contained 6 weeks of coffee shop conversations and night walks along the Han River and all the things they'd been circling without quite saying. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. The question was for her. The rest of the world had ceased to exist. "I am if you are," she said. He covered her hands with both of his. His grip was careful and total. And Park Jaiwan, who had not embraced another person in he genuinely could not remember how many years, pulled her into his arms with the particular desperation of a man who has just spent 4 hours understanding, with absolute and terrifying clarity, exactly how much he has to lose. She held on. She was trembling slightly. So was he, though he would never have admitted it. The guards were definitely looking at the ceiling. What happened to Oh Jung-sik afterward was the kind of comprehensive, methodical unraveling that took weeks and left him with nothing, no organization, no finances, no political connections, no allies, no credibility. No violence was directed at him. Jaiwan was true to himself, true to the code. But Oh Jung-sik had been built on a foundation of alliances he'd never earned, connections he'd leveraged through fear rather than loyalty, and favors he'd called in before he'd fully paid them back. When Jaiwan pulled every thread, the whole structure came apart with the quiet inevitability of a building that was never sound. There was a satisfying footnote to all of this. Choi Dong-woo, Mina's ex-husband, the man with the casual cruelty and the courtroom laugh, had, it turned out, been doing quiet business with Oh Jung-sik for years. Property deals, money of ambiguous origin running through Choi Construction's accounts. This information was not something Jaiwan had gone looking for. Yoonji had simply found it while pulling the full picture of Oh Jung-sik's network and flagged it because it connected to Mina's name. Jaiwan sat with this information for a long moment. He did not act on it through violence or intimidation. What he did was ensure that the relevant portion of Yoonji's financial intelligence reached the appropriate tax authority through appropriate channels. 3 months later, Choi Dong-woo would find himself in a financial inquiry that would occupy his lawyers for the better part of 2 years and result in a settlement that substantially reduced the empire his father had built. He would never understand exactly how it happened. He would never connect it to the quiet woman he'd laughed at in a courtroom. This was, in every way, intentional. Spring came to Seoul. Mina moved out of the safe house and back to her apartment in Mapo. She returned to work. The rhythms of her life rebuilt themselves. Early shifts, evening walks, the specific tender exhaustion of caring for children who were small and sick and needed everything she had. But things were different now. Not smaller. Larger. Jaiwan had spent a long time being a man defined entirely by his world, by the architecture of power and loyalty and strategic silence he'd constructed around himself. He had been complete in that world, in the way that a building that has never had windows is complete, functional, solid, unaware of what it's missing. Mina had not transformed him. That was not the right word. She had not softened him, had not domesticated him, had not required him to be anything other than exactly what he was. What she had done, slowly and without agenda, was simply stay. Stay with her eyes open. Stay with full knowledge of what he was and where he'd come from and the specific moral complexity of a life built in shadows. Stay and look at him like he was worth looking at. For a man who had long since stopped expecting to be seen, this was the most revolutionary thing that had ever happened to him. They took things slowly, deliberately. Jaiwan had spent years moving pieces on a chessboard, and he understood, perhaps better than most, that the things worth having are worth the patience of correct timing. He did not rush her. She did not rush him. What they built together was constructed the way good things are, carefully, with attention, one piece at a time. He told her everything, eventually. Not all at once, but in installments, on quiet evenings in her apartment with the city lit up outside the window. The full truth of what the Black Crane was, how he'd built it, what it had cost him. He told her things he'd never told anyone. He watched her face for the point at which it would become too much. It never came. "I'm not asking you to love what you do," she said one night, after a particularly difficult disclosure. "I'm asking you to be honest with me." "I know the difference," he said. "Then we're fine," she said simply. There was still a world. The Black Crane didn't dissolve overnight, and Jaiwan's responsibilities did not evaporate because his personal life had changed. There were enemies, ongoing negotiations, the perpetual low-grade danger of the life he'd chosen. He was not deluded about this, and neither was she. But he began, slowly, to plan for a different future. Not an exit. He understood, pragmatically, that exits from his world were not clean or quick, but a transition, years in the making, toward a life that was increasingly defined by structure and decreasingly defined by darkness. He had influence. He had resources. There were ways to use both that didn't require standing in warehouse districts at midnight. Seo Jun, who had said nothing for months, finally said something. "You're different," he told Jaiwan, one morning over the world's worst coffee in Jaiwan's office. "I'm exactly the same," Jaiwan said, without looking up from his desk. "You smiled yesterday." "I did not." "You absolutely did. I have a witness." A pause. "Han Seo Jun, if you value your current employment." "I think she's good for you," Seo Jun said, unintimidated, as only someone who had known Jaiwan for 15 years could be. "That's all I wanted to say." Jaiwan looked up. A long moment passed. "Get out of my office," he said. But his expression, though it was subtle, barely a degree of shift, was something that Seo Jun had not seen on his face in 15 years. It was contentment. The moment Mina marked as the real beginning, not the hospital corridor, not the coffee shop, not the warehouse, was a Saturday in April. Jaiwan had come to her apartment for what had become their Saturday evening ritual. Dinner that she cooked and he ate with the solemn appreciation of a man who had been subsisting on restaurant food for years, followed by talking about everything and nothing until the city outside went quiet. She had put a bowl of kimchi jjigae in front of him, and he was eating with his usual quiet focus, and she was watching him without meaning to, the way the evening light came through the window and caught the lines of his face, and she thought, "This is the person I want." Not the power, not the complexity, not even the extraordinary story that had brought them here. Just him. This particular person, eating her soup at her kitchen table, present and real and entirely himself. "What are you thinking?" he asked, without looking up. He always knew when she was looking. "That you eat kimchi jjigae like it's a strategic operation," she said. He looked up. The corners of his mouth moved. That not-quite smile that she'd come to treasure precisely because it was rare. Everything is a strategic operation. Even this. He set down his chopsticks. He looked at her across the small table with the full, undivided weight of his attention. "Especially this," he said quietly. "I have never done anything in my life more carefully than this." She reached across and picked up his hand. He held it immediately, with that same careful iron grip. "I love you," she said, plainly, without preamble, because she was Mina, and that was how she did things. The words landed on him, and she watched him absorb them, the way a dry landscape absorbs the first rain. Slowly, completely, like something that had been waited for. "I know," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges in a way it almost never was. "That's not the correct response," she told him. A beat. And then, quietly, privately, for no audience, in no language except the simple, unadorned language of one person to one person. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since a convenience store in January, and I will love you every day after this, whether it's inconvenient or not. And almost everything about it is inconvenient." She laughed. An actual laugh, full and bright and unguarded. It was, by any measure, the most beautiful thing Park Ji-won had ever heard. There is something specific about the kind of love that arrives after loss. It doesn't have the wide-eyed, untested quality of a first love. It doesn't have the comfort of a long familiarity that has never been shaken. It arrives, instead, into a self that has been broken and rebuilt, and it finds that the rebuilt version, the one with the repaired fracture lines and the carefully chosen new foundations, is actually stronger than the original ever was. Seo Mina had been laughed at in a courtroom. She had walked out of 6 years of her life with less than she'd started with and a quiet determination to build something better from the rubble. She hadn't expected to find what she found. She hadn't been looking for it. But she had been, this is the essential thing, she had been open. Open to the unexpected shape of the next thing, trusting the core of herself even when the world had recently been unkind to her, showing up for others even when she was still showing up for herself. And Park Ji-won had been waiting, in his own guarded, armored way, for someone who would not require him to be lesser than he was. Not someone who would romanticize the darkness, not someone who would pretend it wasn't there, but someone who could look at the whole picture, shadows and all, and choose it anyway. Choose him anyway. Their love was not simple. It would not become simple. There would be years ahead of navigating the specific challenges of a life lived, in part, in shadows. Of balancing the care of a world that didn't operate by daylight rules with the small, essential dailiness of two people building a life together. There would be hard conversations, difficult compromises, moments when the weight of what Ji-won carried threatened to pull everything out of alignment. But they were both, in their different ways, people who showed up, people who did the work, people who understood that love is not a condition that exists independently of effort. It is the effort, sustained and chosen and renewed every single day. The man who laughed in that courtroom was dealing with a tax audit. The man who never laughed was learning how. And somewhere in Seoul, in a small apartment in Mapo, where the evening light came through the kitchen window at just the right angle, a woman who had been discarded and a man who had been isolated were discovering, together, what it meant to be found. And that, my friends, is the story of how Seo Mina went from the floor of a courthouse to the center of the most protected circle in South Korea, not because someone rescued her, but because she refused to stop being exactly who she was, even when the world tried to reduce her to something smaller. She didn't chase power. She didn't seek protection. She simply showed up for a sick child in a hospital corridor, for a stranger in a coffee shop, for a man who didn't know how to let anyone in. And in doing so, she became the thing that Park Ji-won, for all his armored strength and careful strategy, had never managed to acquire. Home. There's a question I want to leave you with today, because I think this story is really about something we all understand on some level. How much of our lives do we spend waiting to be chosen, not realizing that the most powerful thing we can do is simply keep choosing ourselves, keep showing up, keep refusing to let one person's carelessness define what we believe we deserve. Mina didn't transform herself to earn Ji-won's love. She didn't hide what she was or armor herself the way he had. She stayed soft and steady and completely, unapologetically herself. And that was the thing that broke through 15 years of carefully constructed walls. Tell me in the comments, which moment hit you the hardest? Was it the courtroom, the convenience store, the warehouse, or something else entirely? I genuinely want to know, because every single one of you watching this has a story in you too, a moment where the world underestimated you, a moment where something unexpected arrived to change the shape of what was possible. And if this story moved you, if you felt it, then do this for me. Hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like this. Subscribe if you're new, And hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next, because I have stories in the pipeline that are going to absolutely wreck you in the best possible way. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being walked away from is not the end of the story. Sometimes, it is exactly the beginning.